Hey, good morning, Woodruff Road Christian Church. Chris here with our sermon time for Sunday, March 22nd. In case you're waiting for it, kids, you're dismissed to C2. That felt a little more normal in this time of kind of oddity. And as we're looking at this format here of recorded messages, pre-recorded, this is not live. We're choosing to go this route with a link to a YouTube video. Because there's some timing issues with Sunday morning. You may not be ready when I'm ready to preach. You may not be equipped with technology to get into a live stream. We wanted to make sure that you can access this time in the Word when you're ready. So you can sit down for about 20 minutes. I promise it'll be pretty short. You can dive into this sermon with me, dive into Esther with me when you're ready. And we can find ourselves encouraged together, with a good part of the resolution of this story. So this series is wrapping up. Obviously, this is not how I wanted it to end. I wanted us to do this in our worship assembly. But the last two sermons are a two-parter. They go together. So that is essential next week that we remember that. So we're talking about this resolution of the book of Esther. And we're wrapping up her story and the impact that it has on us. And today, we're looking at the positive resolutions that came out of this story. We're looking at the blessings that happened because God is continually working for His people. And God likes His children, thankfully. God is seeking to bless His children continually, even when circumstances look crummy, even when we're isolated, maybe when we're alone, maybe when we're overcome with fear or anxiety. God is, and God continues to be. And so this week, I'm choosing to highlight the good things that come from the story of Esther and that resolution of how things wrap up for her and Mordecai, especially this week. Before next week, we talk about some of the messiness and we find ourselves challenged, specifically challenged for character, some of our character faults next week. So I have my sermon notes pulled up, and so my eye line is going to shift that way every once in a while just to make sure I'm on track, and especially when I read our scriptures, so I don't mess any of that up. Usually that's not an issue when we're live. I could be looking like that, and you wouldn't notice. Maybe you'd notice, some of you who sit close, but for those of you in the back, this is a new feeling. If you ever wanted to know what it was like to not just sit in the front row, but to sit on my podium while I'm preaching, this is the medium for you. What a treat for you it's going to be, really. But let's dive into this word. Let's dive into this time. I want to look at first, and I thought this was appropriate, even more so now today than when I wrote it over a week ago. I wrote into this sermon, the introduction, we're looking at Psalm 23. And I want to look on David's reflections of God's character to him in Psalm 23. And we're landing on this, and why we're including this into our sermon here on Esther is David's confidence in God in the darkest of times, and how regardless of where his feet landed, David is confident in God. David knew this truth. God is. So let's read together Psalm 23. For most of you, this should be very, very, very familiar. This is the first section of Scripture I ever memorized. The Lord is my shepherd. I have all that I need. And this is where we start. This is so appropriate right now. God is what we need. God is providing everything we need. And that is such a scary thing to say because we are driven by the fear of not having enough, especially in a time like this where our grocery stores are having to open at special times so our seniors can get in and get the supplies that they need. God is, and God is providing so much, and David knew this. Where was David writing this from? not in a place of having everything he needed. He was not writing this from the throne room. He was writing this from a cave, most likely, running for his life. And he's able to write that. The Lord is my shepherd. I have all that I need. He lets me rest in green meadows. He leads me beside peaceful streams. Is that what we can say about the character and confidence that we have in God, about where he's leading us right now? He renews my strength. He guides me along right paths, bringing honor to his name. Are we bringing honor to his name with our character right now? Even when I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff protect and comfort me. You prepare a feast for me in the presence of my enemies. You honor me by anointing my head with oil. My cup overflows with blessings. I want to stop right there again. My cup overflows with blessings. Really, David? Yes. 100% yes. Because God is. And God was so prevalent in David's life. Even when he was running for his life, even when circumstances were darkest, he understood that his cup was overflowing with God's blessings because God was so desperately in love with David. And David was so desperately in love with God that even when things went dark, he understood what blessing means. Surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will live in the house of the Lord forever. And that is where we land this week. That's where we need to land in our faith walk right now, that we will live in the house of the Lord forever. You may remember the old spiritual, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. Remember that truth, that this is temporary. What we have right here is temporary. What is being prepared for us is eternal. And how we act right now must reflect our confidence and hope in that. Because the valley of the shadow of death is an appropriate description as we transition into Esther for what Esther and Mordecai went through, what the Jews in captivity were going through. They were constantly under threat, especially when things turned to the more obvious threat from Haman. So let's look here. I'm going to be in Esther chapter 3, 4, and 5 here in the beginning. I want us to remember the picture that was painted for us of their circumstances. Here we go. Esther 3, 5 through 6. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. There we go. The threat of annihilation. It's coming. Esther chapter 3, verse 13. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that the Jews, young and old, including women and children, just to make sure that you know that it's everyone was threatened, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year. The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. This is a valley there's no shadow of death. This is just a valley of death. This is it. There is no threat. There is no something imminent. And what's ironic is that we'll do it next year. So you can think about that day all year long. March 7th. Yeah, things aren't looking good. Esther chapter 4, verse 11. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know, this is Esther responding to Mordecai, know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his golden scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. Esther understands that she's taking her life in her own hands. Esther chapter 4, verse 16. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same, and then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. Esther understands the threat that she's under. This is serious. Death is an option for her taking action. And then let's just build it up here. Here we go. Esther chapter 5, verse 14. So Haman's wife Zeresh and all his friends suggested, set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall, and in the morning ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. This pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole to set up. So not only was the entire nation of the Jews under threat, Mordecai's death vehicle was in place. Haman had set it up actively. It's ready to go. So the threat of death, Mordecai doesn't have to wait till March 7th next year. Mordecai has to walk out his door and see a 75-foot pole that's set up for him. This is the valley of the shadow of death. Not only are we in captivity, not only are we facing this harsh hand of discipline from God in captivity, the threat is there, and it's looming. This is what they were up against. This is familiar territory for us. We've been through all of this in this series. We've been in this book for 10 weeks now. So what happens? How do we resolve this? Let's look at Esther's chapter 8, 9, and 10 as we see some of the resolution for this story. Here we go. Esther chapter 8, verse 1 through 3. On that same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. Then Esther went again before the king, falling down at his feet, and begging him with tears to stop the evil plot devised by Haman the Agagite against the Jews. We're seeing now a rise of Joseph-type proportions for Mordecai. All that was Haman's has now been placed in Mordecai's hands. And so now all that was Haman's that he was using to manipulate and control and threaten and kill, Mordecai is now going to use to protect, to save. Esther chapter 8, 15 through 17. Then Mordecai left the king's presence, wearing that royal robe of blue and white, the great crown of gold, and an outer cloak of fine linen and purple. And the people of Susa celebrated the new decree. Of course they did. The Jews were filled with joy and gladness and were honored everywhere. Of course they were. In every province and city, wherever the king's decree arrived, the Jews rejoiced and had a great celebration and declared a public festival and holiday. And many of the people of the land became Jews themselves. Well, that sounds pretty good, right? No, let's finish this. For they feared what the Jews might do to them. Now, this is a part of our sermon next week, what we're going to talk about, the messiness of this resolution. But naturally, we're going to see some reward here. The Jews were celebrating. The Jews were relieved. They were not going to be killed and annihilated and slaughtered. Instead, they were going to be able to defend themselves. And we see this nation in captivity all of a sudden turn from, well, they're the Jews, they're our slaves, they're our captives, to maybe I want to be like them. Maybe I want to be like them. They are blessed. Do you see how God is working here? Do you see how in even captivity, in the worst, darkest valleys, God is working and people are being converted to Judaism? Even in captivity. Because that's how great and big God is. That's how amazing God is. Our God is working even when things look terrible. Despite our circumstances, God is powerful and great. I'm getting worked up. Esther chapter 9. We're continuing. We have more to talk about here. And the nobles of the provinces, the highest officers, the governors, and the royal officials helped the Jews for fear of Mordecai. For Mordecai had been promoted in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces as he became more and more powerful. Again, this Joseph-like rise to power like he had in Egypt. This Joseph-like power that he's using not to harm, but for good. And the province, this pagan culture, is responding to Mordecai's goodness. There's a lesson in that too. Esther chapter 10, verse 2 and 3. And this is kind of cool. I put this in here and I have a silly comment here. His great achievements, Mordecai, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Media and Persia. That looks pretty good on a resume. Oh, you haven't read my story? It's written in the book of the history of the kings of Media and Persia. You might want to look it up. Anyways, that's pretty cool. But Mordecai the Jew became the prime minister with authority next to that of King Xerxes himself. Now remember Xerxes' place. He considered himself God. Small g. He considered himself God. And so now Mordecai, who does not consider himself God, is given all the power and authority in the kingdom. He was very great among the Jews who held him in high esteem, naturally, because he continued to work for the good of his people and to speak up for the welfare of all their descendants. Church, as we look at this story, as we look at even some of the nastiness, every opportunity that God had to bless his people, he took. Every opportunity. Because God's children prevail. Because God's children, even if it doesn't mean right here, right now, God's children prevail. He is preparing a place for us with cool waters, green pastures. The cup that we're holding that feels so empty right now is about to overflow with his blessing. We are about to be united with him. How we live here and how we act right here and now is a testament to what we believe and what we believe about the character of God in our own story, in our own context. God is faithful to every one of his promises, and God will deliver us. Now, there's an interesting point that I want to make here as we get close to wrapping up. This is from Esther chapter 4. Do you remember that mess of verses that I messed up at the very beginning? Glad I brought that up. Esther chapter 4, verse 14. This is from the heart of Esther's story. There's a moment in here that I want us to look at, that I want us to see and maybe look at from a different perspective, but I also want us to find hope. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will come from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. Now, on one way of looking at this looks like a guilt trip of epic proportion from Mordecai. Just so you know, God can still deliver us, but you're going to die. Maybe you should do something. But hear this. Hear this in light of God's character. God is. If you keep quiet, Esther, at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. Why? Because God is. God is faithful to every one of his promises. Every time. God's plan from the very beginning, including the story of Esther, including our story right now, but God's plan from the very beginning was to deliver his people. And he is faithful to his promise. And deliverance, even if Esther failed to move, was going to happen because God delivers on his promises. Church, this is our opportunity to live what we believe. This is our opportunity to prove our belief. We are the church. We are God's children. We may feel like we're in captivity sometimes. We may feel like we are being set upon sometimes. We are perfectly placed in this opportunity. Whether you feel like it's the shadow, the valley of the shadow of death, or whether you feel like you've been set on a throne, whether you feel isolated and alone and abandoned, or whether you're surrounded right now with those you love. This is our opportunity to prove what we believe. Do you believe that God is? I hope so. Church, I cannot wait to get back together with you. I cannot wait to join you again in worship and sing together. I know this is weird. This is so different. But church, know that we are the body of Christ. Even though we're apart right now, we are together. And I am honored to serve with you. Let's take every opportunity in this time of social distancing, this time of weird viruses, to show and prove our love for Christ. I cannot wait to get back together. I mean that. I'll see you soon.